their website. On January 6th, 2021, violent rioting Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in an attempt to prevent the certification of the 2020 presidential election, which, by the way, is more of a formality than anything else. It's not like if you stop that process from happening, Trump automatically gets another 4 years or something like that. But it is a process by which Joe Biden, who was elected in November, would officially be validated as the next president of the United States. Now, the first thing I'd like to address related to this incident are folks that compare this attempted coup to the protests and riots that ensued after the murder of George Floyd, known as the Black Lives Matter protests that took place throughout the summer. Now, to do so, in my opinion, is to ignore the plight of Black people in this country and factoring in the historical perspective, which I'll dive into a bit in a second. But it is important to note that during the Black Lives Matter protests, you had a few different things going on. You had peaceful protesters, which by all accounts and purposes were the vast majority. You had rioters, both part of the whole Black Lives Matter protests and also just opportunist rioters, people that just wanted to fuck shit up, that have nothing to do with the movement, but saw an opportunity to like blend in and do what they wanted to do. And then you had a faction of opportunist looters that again saw an opportunity to fuck some shit up and steal some shit. They're all incorrectly, in my opinion, lumped together into this quote unquote Black Lives Matter movement. But that's where I guess the comparison comes in. Then in this attempted coup on the Capitol, you have a few different things going on as well. You have the majority of Trump supporters. Then it's within reason to believe that you also have similar subsections of that group. People that were just there because they're caught up in the hype, people that are just there to fuck shit up, that don't really care about Trump, etc. But for the purposes of this episode and this segment of it, I want to compare the two majorities. On one hand, you have Trump supporters storming a Capitol, not peacefully protesting, which in and of itself is an act of violence, versus the other side, which is a majority of peaceful protesters. Now, these Trump supporters feel, at least my understanding is, that they are fighting for something. They're not just malicious human beings that want to tear down Capitol buildings. They're largely misinformed, in my opinion, folks that were incited to believe that the election was stolen from them, that their voices are not heard, that they're being gamed, that their democracy has been eroded by the other side, and they've been egged on to believe that this type of behavior is what's necessary when their voices are not heard by the President of the United States. Through months and months of that literal type of rhetoric. And to folks that felt that way, I want to give a quick shout out to D.L. Hughley, who said, for the folks that feel unheard as a result of these elections, imagine the people that have felt unheard since the year 1619. Seriously take a second to let the two differences sink in between an election cycle that didn't go your way versus hundreds of years of oppression, both of which bubbled up with culminating moments of, on one side, having a sitting president inciting violence, and on the other side, the murder of George Floyd, that then created these two types of protests that are being compared now. Imagine chilling, being at home, being with your family, being in your country, then being torn away from your family, put in chains, shipped off to a foreign land, where you are then forced to do manual labor. You have no say of when you eat, sleep, shit. Your women are raped routinely for 240. Run that back. 240 plus years. 244, I believe. So that happens to you, your kids, your kids' kids, your great-grandchildren, and you're treated the exact same way. You're a piece of property. You're an animal. You're less than. That is ingrained not only into you as a black slave, but on the flip side, in the minds of the slave owners. they are less than. They are property. They are animals. There's generations of that type of mentality being perpetuated on both sides. Then in 1863, you have the Emancipation Proclamation that President Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, actually, signed into law, which essentially freed the slaves, quote unquote, freed the slaves. But they were freed without a pot to piss in after, again, 240 plus years of slavery and oppression. No land, no rights, no jobs, no identity, no history, no legacy. Just from one day to the next, poof. All right, you guys are freed. Go do something. And I mentioned the no jobs, no land, etc., because at the exact same time, European immigrants were coming to this country, immigrating to this country. I want to underline that. And given land by the government, given opportunities to build wealth, generational wealth. This is 1863, the year 1863. And this was going on, the land giving throughout the Midwest and the West, all throughout. But slaves have been emancipated, right? Then you go through this era of legal segregation under the Jim Crow laws for another century. Let these numbers sink in. Another 100 years of legal segregation. So the slaves are quote unquote freed, but this is where you see black schools, white schools, black water fountains, white water fountains, restaurants where colored folks can't go to, but white folks can. Segregation, separation, where that ingrained mentality that is already so entrenched in the fabric of this country just gets compounded more and more. Oh, you think you're free? You're not free. Go drink off that colored fountain over there. Nope, you can't be served in my restaurant. For another 100 years. And I'm not going to turn this into a full-blown history lesson podcast. I'm not a fucking historian or anything like that by any stretch, but you can go even deeper into the maliciousness of things going on in this time, where deliberate maliciousness, by the way, of where during this time where folks didn't have jobs, didn't have homes, etc., loitering was considered a jailable offense. So if a black guy doesn't have a job, doesn't have a house, he's literally obviously in the street, he can now be incarcerated. And when you're incarcerated, those quote unquote freedoms that you were emancipated with get stripped away. And guess what? Slave labor is okay again. Do you not see the hypocrisy there? But that's a whole other topic. Take a deep dive into that if you'd like. So 240 plus years of literal slavery. Then you're quote unquote freed into another 100 years of legal segregation. And then you're finally, after almost 400 years, considered quote unquote equal. Now I say all that to highlight that racism is this country's oldest virus, which still exists and has no vaccine. It's rooted in the legacy of slavery, and nobody can refute that. It is beyond contestation. The crazy and insidious thing is, though, that it's learned behavior. There's no biological predisposition to racism. But I say that to say that as it existed then, it exists today. In most cases, not as blatantly as it did, but it is part of the mentality and actions and reactions of some people today. And some of those people are people in positions of power, people in positions of influence, whether it be within a corporate structure or in the judicial system, lawyers, judges, law enforcement. Again, not saying that all are, just saying that people are people. And people come from different backgrounds and are raised within different cultures, with different thought processes, with different ideas and ideologies, with different influences. And you can see it in our legislature with elected officials. And again, I want to be very clear that I'm not saying that everyone that stormed the Capitol is a racist bigot or that every Trump supporter is, because they're not. Some folks are they just have conservative values. And this happens to be the guy on the conservative ticket that can get some of my things passed that I believe in. Some of my ideologies moved more towards becoming law. So this is the horse that I'm riding on right now. But there are other folks that are racist, that have these racist tendencies, these racist ideologies that inform their decision making. that makes them egg on a following of people that they have listening to them, that spew rhetoric of their elections and their democracy being stolen from them, that their rights are being eroded, and incite riots like and the exact riot that we saw on January 6th. And as a result, people lose their lives. I believe during the Black Lives Matter protests, I think the death count is up to a couple dozen or just shy of that. During this one incident at the Capitol, 5 people died, including, by the way, a police officer or security guard that was just trying to do his job that happened to be a Trump supporter. He got beat by other Trump supporters with a fire extinguisher and then subsequently died at the hospital from those injuries. But if you don't see the difference between 400 years of slavery and oppression culminating in the public murder of George Floyd, which is likely this generation's Emmett Till, versus voters who have been incited and misinformed being upset that their guy didn't win and proceeding to do the actions that we saw on January 6th, then I don't know what to tell you, but I'm definitely not going to argue with you. Because
a wise man told me don't argue with fools, because people from a distance can't tell who is who.
I'll tell you what, though, I definitely want to see the same energy kept from when Trump pointed out the Statutes and Monuments Act and signed an executive order stating that anybody who defaces any federal land, including statues and monuments, will get a minimum 10-year jail sentence. I want to see that same energy kept. And I am happy that the folks that the FBI has been able to find from like the videos and selfies and shit like that these fucking idiots posted of themselves, which is just like a whole other, even though we saw like different age groups within there, it's just a whole other lens by which you can view this generation poorly, and you know how we quote unquote tell on ourselves and post shit about ourselves for clout basically, and just put everything out there on social media. Like a bunch of these clowns got round up quickly because of that. But yeah, I'm definitely glad they are getting arrested, but I want to see like the follow through with this, and it'll be interesting to see what that actually comes out to be. And, you know, going back to the point where I said like racism doesn't have to be blatant, but you see remnants of it and you see like ripples of it, how certain ideologies like permeate generations. I'll give you an example of that. I know someone that told me once, while the Black Lives Matter protests were beginning to happen, like across different cities and, you know, different states and across the globe really. But while they were like, you know, picking up after a few days and, you know, continuing, like I literally had somebody tell me, but we get it. Why are they still protesting? If they already protested, why can't they just go home? And this is before like police cars were set on fire and the rioting and the looting and shit like that, that some subsets of that group that they devolved to. Yo entre me, I'm like, really, dude? Because nothing has changed. Protesting is not a mechanism by which you hold the protest, do it once, and then subsequent change stems from it. Those protests, those walks, those marches that don't yield anything year after year after year after year, century after century after century, it's like, that's not how it works. That's why they're not just quote unquote going home after a day or two of protesting and after what the entire world witnessed. Imagine being not heard since 1619. I'll give you another example with Colin Kaepernick, who, say what you want to say about him, when he was kneeling in protest of police brutality. In hindsight, if some change actually happened from that peaceful protest, would we have had the George Floyd situation? I don't know. But my point is that was peaceful protesting. That was actually the way that a white Marine, United States Marine, taught him was the respectful way to peacefully and silently protest during the national anthem, as opposed to sitting, which I believe he was doing beforehand. And then what happens? You get people shitting on him. Why is he doing that? He shouldn't be doing this. It's disrespectful. Make up your fucking minds. What do you want? Peaceful protests? Riots? Nothing? Sit down and shut up? Is that what you want? Come on, dog. And then from a business perspective, the guy gets blackballed, dropped from his team. I don't know enough about football to get into the semantics of, was he actually good enough to be on the team? You know, it should be based on his merit, which I agree with. But from everything that I've heard, he would at least be a second stringer, at least. Probably starting on some of the shitty teams. fucking won a Super Bowl a couple years before that, for Christ's sakes. So just from a veteran OG perspective, to have a guy like that in the locker room would be beneficial to a young team. But semantics, right? My point with bringing up this example is not just the juxtaposition between people complaining about protests and riots, and then also complaining about silent and peaceful protests, but also to bring up the private business piece of this conversation, which is the NFL is a private organization. They can do whatever the fuck they want with their organization. Just like Facebook, just like Twitter. Those of you that feel that corporations should have the same rights as people and elect officials, congressmen and women, senators, presidents that are all for deregulation's sake, this is what you get. Hashtag Citizens United. Companies, corporations are literally mandated to increase shareholder returns quarter after quarter after quarter. They will, of course, it's their fiduciary responsibility to do what's in their best financial interest. If their base of supporters, meaning a corporation, their customers, their financing, the pool of money coming their way is coming mainly from a conservative bend, and you have a black dude kneeling in protest and people don't really get the nuances of it, but just kind of blanket that into that's disrespectful to the country, that's a bad look from a corporate perspective. So let's do away with that guy. Go where the money's at. Then you have companies seeing the money play from the other side. Nike, let's put a cap on some merch and sell it. There's an untapped resource there. Will be looked at as the quote-unquote good guys. This pool of potential customers is growing. Which leads me to the whole discussion on social media banning Trump. Meaning Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, kicking Trump off of their platforms as private companies, which have the right to do so. And I believe to date, Twitter is a permanent ban, whereas Facebook and Instagram have allowed him back in. Now, this is, I believe, a debate, a topic that we're going to hear a lot more of, not just through and around Trump, but just the larger debate of should social media and big tech companies be regulated? Have they gotten to a point in size, in influence, in their ability to literally change and overthrow governments? Have they gotten to this monopolistic size where they can't be afforded the free reign rights of corporations can do whatever the fuck they want? Is it a free speech issue? Which is the side that I tend to lean toward, personally. But I definitely see both sides of it. Sam Harris, for example, on the Waking Up podcast, was discussing several things, and he touched on the fact that he doesn't believe this is a free speech issue. And he stated about Trump that Trump has violated Twitter's terms of service for years, including threatening nuclear war, attacking private citizens, knowing that millions of his rabid followers would dox them, seek them out, possibly do harm. He knowingly spread misinformation. And as Sam Harris pointed out, people have gotten kicked off of Twitter every single day for far less. And then to folks that say, yeah, but you have China's Communist Party has an official Twitter page or something like that. And Sam Harris says, yeah, they should be fucking kicked off too. All valid points by someone whose opinion I highly respect. But I can't help it be weary of where is that line drawn? Who's doing the deciding? Who are the decision makers here in terms of who gets blocked and banned and kicked off and is essentially silenced? It's a really slippery slope, and hence the crux of the debate, right? Because think of things like, for example, flat earthers, people who believe the earth is flat. To me, flat earth is like the gateway idea to retardation. But should those folks not be able to talk or express their misinformed ideas? I don't know. Maybe they should be able to. And the way to correct for those types of ideas are with good ideas and knowledge and science and facts. But then on the flip side of that, you have folks like the president that use it to incite violence, use it as a tool to spread misinformation. You have companies, literal companies. I believe one that a journalist, Rene DiResta, covered, was called the Internet Research Agency. I believe I have that correct. but it's something like that. And it's like literally like a corporate 9-to-5 gig in Russia. That's a troll farm. And their job is to clock in, clock out, and spend the whole day on Facebook, creating Trump groups, creating Hillary groups, creating and sowing disinformation and misinformation to the point that they literally go into pro-Trump pages and then go into anti-Trump pages and put forward suggestions for meeting up in real life, not just on Facebook, and having like a protest or a riot. And then they also organize an opposite party protest or riot, or let's say, for the sake of argument, a BLM protest or riot literally across the street, so that these two groups show up at the same exact time and you cause chaos. Like, there's people who's literally right now as I speak, that's what they're doing right now. That's their work. And that's fucked up. I see the need to not have that, but at what cost? It's a really interesting debate. I know I've killed this quote to death, but I'm reminded of Benjamin Franklin's quote of, "He who gives up freedom for safety deserves neither." And to Sam Harris's point, people are removed from social media every day. The comedian Lil Duval, he puts up like posts and like funny shit, and he's blocked and kicked off all the time. I think he's on his like third or fourth Instagram account now. There was a show, a popular podcast actually, that was in an Australian conspiracy theory podcast from a guy named Pete Evans. Spotify removed his show, and he was removed from Facebook like a year ago. Like, shit happens all the time, but clearly not enough, right? My brother sent me a 60 minutes piece of, people being outed and doxxed, just like by like conspiracy theorists. And there was a case with the whole Sandy Hook massacre where there's this conspiracy theory that it was really a false flag and it never happened. And the parents who lost their child are being like harassed and terrorized every day by these fucking whack jobs. And they have no recourse, really. Like, what do you do? And my fix to that, which is not obviously a panacea, this is a very fractured issue, but a step in the right direction, I believe, would be that do away with the anonymity online. I guarantee you that 95% or more of the people online, and that's a very scientific figure that I just pulled out my ass, but I guarantee you, like the tough talk and the bullshit and the rhetoric and stuff like that these people spew online, and they have like an avatar of like an egg on Facebook or a picture of something else, I guarantee you would see a huge drop in that if people had the ability to know who the fuck you really are. And I don't mean, putting someone's name and address and phone number. Obviously that has its own like dangers and shit like that, like publicly for everybody to see. I just mean for like from the perspective of like Twitter, for example, they have verified accounts, right? You can't just say that you're Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks has to go through a process to be verified as, okay, this is the real Tom Hanks. Make everybody go through a similar process by which, they could use screen names or whatever the fuck they want, but their actual names, known address, some sort of identification to who they actually are, Twitter, Facebook, these big tech companies have on the back end and are mandated to hand over to the authorities when and if there's a situation where that person ensues a riot or doxes someone or is harassing someone. Because now somebody on the receiving end of that, they don't have the recourse to go after that person or go after the social media company. And I get the argument from the side of the social media company of, we can't control everybody on here. We created this platform. We kick people off every day, but we can't, people fall through the cracks. And we can't be sued by everybody that gets their feeling hurt online. Because if we did, then we wouldn't exist. So it's like a catch-22, right? But I also want to point out on the flip side of all this, something Andrew Schultz and Charlemagne were saying on the Brilliant Idiots podcast, which is the hypocrisy of these big social media tech platforms on now banning Trump after he clearly violated the terms of service for years. And now, a couple weeks before he's out of office, then kick him out. After making buku bucks on him and his content and his followers and shit like that. And then back to Sam Harris, he thinks that Facebook should be definitely broken up, similar to how Monopoly is broken up, and agrees to regulation for social media companies, and maybe they should be treated more like utilities or telecom companies. Before we get there, though, I think this undoing the whole anonymity thing could help, and where people know that their actions will be privy to the possibility of legal action. And then for those situations where the social media platform fucks up and, doesn't kick somebody off in time before they do some shit that truly affects someone else, then they're held liable as well. I don't know, just food for thought. And the last point that I'll bring up related to Sam Harris's Waking Up podcast, which I thought was interesting, was related to the polarization problem that we have between the left and the right. He points out how you can have cancer and heart disease at the same time. These aren't like mutually exclusive problems. They're issues that have different symptoms and different sources. And he warns against the left harping on the idea that if this was black and brown people storming the Capitol, things would have been a lot different. A lot of more people would have died. Which, if I had to make a bet, if somebody told me, would you bet everything you have that if this was a Black Lives Matter protest and it was black and brown people storming the Capitol, what's the over-under of more or less than 5 people dying during that occurrence? I would go all in and say more. I'd take the over every day. But his point, which I agree with, is that it's become this like talking point where Biden, Kamala, the Obamas, all the left-leaning talking heads are saying the same thing. And then the conversation goes to that point, that singular point of if it was black and brown people, they would have been treated differently. To me, I think, of course, but I see his point of then this entire situation only becomes about that. It doesn't become about the bigger issue. Because now it becomes a whole conversation of, oh, now the Democrats are hypocrites, and now they have a problem with rioting. Now they have a problem with protesting and stuff like that. Because folks like Biden and Kamala, which although they did condone those actions when they were happening, as most of them, Democrats and left-leaning folks did, they didn't do so enough, which I could definitely see that argument. And the last thing that Harris points out is to a bigger issue that now Putin and Xi Jinping from China, Putin from Russia, can now show that their constituents, their country, see, democracy doesn't work. Look, these fucking clowns over there, storming the Capitol, protesting the streets, black versus white. Look at that. That doesn't work. That's democracy. You guys want that here? That's dangerous. Especially now that we are in a geopolitical, global economy type of situation. We're not the, big swinging dicks anymore. The playing field is being leveled. Did you guys hear about Jack Ma, by the way? Slightly off topic, but to the point of the dangers of having the ideologies of a country like China being exacerbated throughout the globe. Jack Ma, billionaire, creator and founder of Alibaba, gave some speech, some statement around slightly criticizing, but like a veiled criticism of China and its economy. Not only one of the richest men in China, multi-billionaire, one of the richest people on the planet. After those statements, homeboy disappeared. Nobody has seen him since. There's some ideas that maybe, he's in hiding because, he said something that he shouldn't have said. But one of the richest, most influential people on the planet saying a slight criticism of his country either got disappeared or took it upon himself to disappear himself. And you have the leaders of that country, Xi Jinping, gaining points for their ideologies and that type of mentality that makes it so that people have to be silenced because of the divisive, divide and conquer approach that we take within our country. And by we, I mean our culture, our politics, our social interactions, all of it. Now, one positive thing that I'll say in closing from the past 4 years is that Trumpito has been so polarizing that so many more people have come into the political process, whether it be voting for the first time or just paying attention more to politics because he was so polarizing. And we see that with just voter turnout in general. Trump got the most votes ever by any sitting president ever in history. Biden got the most votes ever by any presidential candidate in history. I think that's a good thing. I think that's a positive. And I'm recording this literally a day before the inauguration of Joe Biden as president. So unless within the next 24 to 48 hours, Trumpito hasn't started like a fucking nuclear war with Iran or something on his way out, or has done some other fuck shit. You'll be listening to this episode the day after or days after Joe Biden is sworn in as president, because the episode is going to literally drop the day after. But my message, I guess, to you folks listening, and it's definitely something that I'm going to push forward with myself, is to keep that same engagement energy. Don't think, oh, now, Joe Biden and Kamala are in power, so we can go back to normal and not care about politics. That's what happened with Obama. We were under the false impression one guy could do it all, even when he had Senate and congressional control. Took our foot off the gas, didn't show up to the midterm elections, and the majority of what he wanted to do for 6 years was intentionally just blocked. And I'm not saying you have to be Democrat, you have to be Republican. I'm just saying continue to pay attention, whatever side you're on. And Biden and Harris both have admitted wrongs in their past, with the 94 crime bill on Biden's side, or excessive sentencing for petty charges on Harris's side, and so forth. And these are wrongs that they have to be held accountable for. Now that they're in office, they can be held accountable for them. Now's the time to stay active, stay vigilant, continue to pay attention, and make sure you hold them and our other elected officials at the federal, state, city, and local levels accountable by voting them in and out, by interacting with their offices when necessary, so that they can rectify those wrongs as best they can.